Today we have satellite imaging and GPS. We have satellite phones and the experience of 100 years of climbing. I asked National Geographic Explorer-in-Residence Wade Davis, in the 1920s, what did climbers know? What could they know about climbing Mount Everest?
I knew very, very little more. I mean, Everest had sort of emerged in the last years of the Raj as sort of the third pole. The British and Empire explorers had lost the race for the North and South Pole, and here in their very midst was this third pole that rose into the heavens. And so the quest for Everest began really as a sort of a gesture of redemption for an empire of explorers that had lost those races. But because of the intervening war, where so much of Britain was destroyed by the mud of Flanders, it emerged as a kind of a gesture of regeneration for a nation bled white by war. So that was always my interest in the story of George Mallory.
So here we are, we're in the early 1920s, and Britain is still has India. It still has India. It has another 20-25 years to go before it will turn India back to the Indians. And so, in a sense, the empire, the great global empire of Britain, has really been gnawed by the Great War.
Well, that was a seminal event of our times. Churchill famously described the Second World War as just the second half of the First World War. He called it the 30 Years' War. And he famously said, never was there a war less necessary to fight than the first, or more necessary to win than the second. I became interested in the story of George Mallory really in a serendipitous way. I was traveling 4,000 miles across Tibet as part of an ecological survey in the spring of '96 when the disaster happened on Everest that John Krakauer so powerfully wrote about in his book Into Thin Air. And with me was Daniel Taylor, who was son and grandson of medical missionaries, and his father had been a great friend of Howard Somerville, who climbed with George Mallory in 1922 and 24. And the very next fall, Daniel and I were back on the east face of Everest, in the Kanchan face, in the Gama Valley, trying to photograph clouded leopards. And Daniel, in his inimitable way, began to speak of these Englishmen in tweeds reading Shakespeare to each other in the snow at 20,000 feet. And that was the Everest of his imaginings, not the kind of ignoble commercial world of today. And as he spoke to me, I became enchanted by these men. Who were they? And I was never interested in whether George Mallory made it to the top or not on that fateful day. The story goes on June 8th, 1924, he's spotted by Noel Dell with his young companion Sandy Irvin going strong for the top on the northeast ridge, with the mist coming in that envelops their memory and myth, and they have never seen or heard from again. The question is, did Mallory make it before he died? And what interested me is what spirit carried him on. And my first thought as a Canadian, as a historian of the war, was to think that, for this entire generation, death had no mystery. They had seen so much of death that on the Western Front that it had nothing to teach them save that of their own, and that for this entire generation, life mattered less than the moments of being alive. And it was that spirit that carried these men forward. That was my idea when I began the project 12 years ago. And one of the things that I discovered, that of the 26 men who went to Everest in 21, 22, and 24, 2 had escaped the war, being too old. One was too young. One sat out the war as a school teacher. One was a diplomat. But 20 most assuredly did see the fighting. And one of the things about World War I is it was famously said of the British Army that it lacked the clerk power to tabulate the dead of Passchendaele or the Somme. But if it lacked the power to tabulate the dead at those battles, it recorded just about everything else. It was the most thoroughly documented war history. And because the British zone of operations was remarkably small, never larger than the county of Lincolnshire, the British front, believe it or not, was, for much of the war,